Right. Well, we'll address. Thank you, Amir, and thank you again for inviting me. Always a pleasure and an honor to talk to you and to the teachers, especially those of you who are just starting teaching, and that's really who we want to talk to this evening. I'll say this evening, even though the sun is just sun is still rising here in Los Angeles, and well, you still have sun there, which is great, right?
Yeah.
So at least we're not. It's not too dark for you. Well, I'm going to talk about some questions related to second language acquisition and second language teaching. That's my topic. If we have time at the end of our presentation, I'll be happy to take some questions. It's very difficult for me to focus on questions that you might put in the chat box as I'm speaking. So I'm not ignoring you. I'm just trying to focus on our main message. And then when that's done, if we have time, of course, we can take some of those questions and give me a chance to look at them. Now, Amir has mentioned that all of you have, I hope, seen the video that I recorded about 6-8 months ago on fundamentals of language acquisition. I just want to start with a very, very brief overview of 5 of the main points that I make in that video, and that's going to lead us into or transition us into talking about some specific questions that often come up. I've been teaching second language acquisition for 30 years to students. So there are some questions I know that are fairly common that people ask after they hear a basic presentation of these 5 points. So there are 5 basic hypotheses that we think are true in second language acquisition. And these were hypotheses developed by Dr. Stephen Krashen of the University of Southern California, now emeritus professor there. The first big hypothesis is a definition, and that is the difference between learning and acquisition. We think that there are 2 different kinds of knowledge that your brain has. One of them is conscious knowledge of language, and this is called learning. The second and more important kind of knowledge is unconscious knowledge. This is your feel for language. This is what you use mostly when you are listening and reading and speaking and writing. So the most important aspect of language between those 2, between learning and acquisition, is definitely acquisition, okay? So that's the first big idea, the first hypothesis. We get learning by studying consciously. We study rules, we memorize things, that's learning. Acquisition comes from something different. Acquisition comes from something that we call comprehensible input, and I'll define that in a minute. The one thing I want to emphasize here is that learning and acquisition are separate systems in your brain. One does not become the other. Just because you study something and know it consciously doesn't mean that you will also acquire it unconsciously. So that's a big point. All right, second idea that I talked about is something called the natural order hypothesis. And I'm not sure how much detail I went into it, but basically the idea is that the structures of language that we acquire, things like the third person singular S, or the use of the plural S, or ing for present progressive.
I have mistakenly actually switched it off or shut the call down, but we are back on track now, Jeff. I think you can continue.
Okay. Hopefully everybody will come back on here and, well, they'll have the recording. So if they miss something, and we're reviewing, good thing we're just reviewing right now anyway, right? Okay, so the second major point had to do with what we call the natural order hypothesis. And this says that we acquire grammatical structures in a certain order. And that order is the same for almost everyone. In other words, it doesn't matter what language you are coming from. When you learn English, you learn certain things in a certain order. And that's called the natural order hypothesis. I'm sorry, let me correct myself. You acquire things in a certain order. You can learn things in any order, right? I can teach you the third person singular S. He goes, she goes, it goes. I can teach you that rule on the very first day of class, but you're not going to acquire it subconsciously or unconsciously until very late. And we don't know why that is, but for reasons we don't fully understand, some things are acquired very late, meaning you need hours, maybe years of input in English in order to acquire them. So that's the second big idea, the natural order hypothesis. The third big idea is the most important one, and that is what we call the input hypothesis. And the input hypothesis says we acquire languages when we get what's called comprehensible input. And comprehensible input means that we can understand the language that we are listening to or that we are reading. Comprehensible input, once we understand language, we're able to start acquiring new aspects of the language. Now, the way this works is important, so I'm going to spend a little extra time on this. The way that we acquire languages is that we take what we know already and we apply it to what we don't know. Some people think, well, how could you possibly acquire something new if you have to understand it? If you understand it, well, you've already acquired it. So there seems to be a paradox there. There seems to be a contradiction there. But let me resolve that for you very easily by saying this. What happens is that you take the language that you understand and you apply it to the language you don't understand. So if I give you a word that you don't understand, but you understand all the other words around that word, you're going to be able to figure out what that word is. So if I say, this is a wug, this is a wug, you may not have understood what a wug is, but by showing you my wug, right, now you understand it. You've taken other information and you've applied it to the word that you didn't know before. In this case, a wug. Now, of course, this isn't a wug. I just made that word up. This is a coffee cup, right? But the idea, the principle is important. We take what we know and we apply it to what we don't know. And that's really the basis of all learning, if you think about it, okay? All right, a fourth major idea is what we call the monitor hypothesis. And the monitor hypothesis says that we are able to use that conscious learning. Remember, I said there are two types of knowledge, learning and acquisition. Acquisition is what we use 99% of the time. But sometimes we can also use our conscious knowledge, what we get when we study a grammar book or when we try to memorize a rule, for example. We can use that knowledge, but we can only use it in a very narrow sense, in a very limited number of cases, okay? The reason is that in order to use your conscious knowledge, you have to be focused on the rule, focused on the form. In other words, you have to be focused on how you're saying something. You have to know the rule, of course. You can't use a rule if you don't know it. And third, you have to have time to use the rule. It turns out that these are very difficult conditions to meet. It's very difficult for you to be able to have time, know the rule, and be focused on the correctness of what you're saying. Those three conditions are necessary for using your conscious learning. And as we'll see in the very first question, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, it's very difficult for you to actually use your conscious learning, which is why we think that acquisition is more important. Okay, the fifth big idea is what we call the affective filter. And the affective filter explains why two different people in the same situation getting the same type of English input may not acquire the same things. One of the things that we think is going on here is that there are psychological reasons, psychological things that block the input from getting into your brain and being acquired. Now, this is a very interesting topic, but I don't have time to talk a lot about it today. But maybe if you have questions, we can come back to this. Okay, we are going to talk about it a little bit when we talk about accents in a minute. All right, that is a basic, very quick review of some of the main points I talked about in the first video, the fundamentals of language acquisition or second language acquisition. Now I want to talk about some specific questions that people often have when we're dealing with second language acquisition. So the first big question is, what about grammar? Should we teach grammar? Is grammar important? I've often, you have lots of teachers who spend a lot of time teaching grammar. Is this a good idea? Okay, well, remember that we just mentioned two different kinds of knowledge. We talked about acquisition, which is subconscious or unconscious knowledge, and we talked about learning. Learning is conscious. Studying grammar is also conscious. That is, if you're going to consciously study grammar rules, you're going to improve your learning. Is that a good thing? Sure, it's a good thing. However, it's not going to improve your acquisition. These are two separate systems. So studying grammar consciously is not going to improve your grammar instruction. Now, for those of you who are new to teaching or perhaps have never actually taught a class, I'm going to make a prediction, okay? Here is something that's going to happen to you probably in your first week or 2 weeks of teaching. And those of you who are veteran teachers, professors like Amir and others, they know this is true, okay? So here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to teach a grammar rule to your students, okay? And you're going to say, okay, kids, here's the grammar rule. It's this and this and this. The next day or the next week, you're going to come back and you're going to ask them what that rule is, and they're going to have forgotten it, okay? You taught it to them, but they forgot it. Now, it's not because they're bad students. It's not because you're a bad teacher. It's because conscious knowledge of language is what we call fragile, F-R-I-G-I-L-E. Something that is fragile is easily broken, or in this case, is easily forgotten. Our conscious memory, when we try to memorize things, it's very difficult to do. It's not the natural way that your brain wants to work. And so when you try to study things, you will often forget them. And that's what happens with grammar instruction. Now, remember I said that in order to use your conscious knowledge, your learning, you have to know the rule. That's the very first condition. But it's very difficult to know the rule because you have to consciously try to memorize it, and that's difficult. It takes a lot of time to do that. So the very first problem with grammar instruction is it's really hard. Don't blame your students. Your students aren't lazy. Well, some of them are lazy, okay? But the reason that they forget the grammar rules you teach them is not because they're lazy or not because they're stupid. It's because it's really difficult to consciously memorize things. And that is one of the problems with grammar instruction. It's really hard to teach and remember. That's the hard part, right? It's easy to teach it, but to remember them all is very difficult. So grammar instruction is limited in part because your brain just doesn't find it very easy to take that knowledge and to remember it. Memorization is very difficult. Now, grammar instruction is not the same as grammar knowledge. Knowledge, remember, comes in two forms. It comes in learning, and it comes in acquisition. You have a lot of grammar knowledge in your acquisition. We acquire grammar, we acquire syntax, we acquire phonology, we acquire all the systems of language unconsciously by getting comprehensible input. So when I say grammar isn't important, I don't mean literally grammar isn't important in language. Of course, it's extremely important. Your brain acquires all of that language without you having to know it consciously. So yes, grammar is very important. We wouldn't have language. It's part of language, right? But it's not something that you have to study consciously. And when you do, it's very limited, because in order to use it, first of all, you have to know the rule. And as I mentioned earlier, when we talked about the monitor hypothesis, you have to have time to use the rule. And it's very difficult, especially in oral communication, when you're speaking and listening, to stop and say, oh, gee, what was that rule again? Hold on a second, I got to think of that rule. That's really hard to do. It is possible to do it in writing, and I'm going to come back to that case in a couple of minutes. Okay, we'll talk about grammar and writing in just a minute. Okay, so let's move on to our second big question. We've talked about grammar and why grammar instruction, it's not the worst thing you can do in your classroom. It's useful sometimes, especially at the beginning for students. If I were learning a new language, it would be useful for me to know whether the verb comes first or the subject comes first, whether how nouns and verbs relate. Those things are useful things for students to know, especially adult students, because adult students think that grammar is important. So one of the reasons we give grammar to adult students is because they'll feel unsatisfied, they'll feel dissatisfied unless they get some, which is fine. But you have to realize that it's extremely limited in what you can do with it. And that's the point I want to make. Okay, let's talk about the second question I have on my list here, which is, should we correct student mistakes? Should we do what's called error correction, whether it's speaking or whether it's writing? This is a really important point, because lots of teachers, even if they understand comprehensible input, still think that they should be spending a lot of time fixing their students' mistakes, okay? All right, first, let's go back to that prediction I made a couple of minutes ago about when you start teaching grammar and you find out that your students can't remember the rule that you taught them just last week, right? Here's another prediction. When you correct student mistakes and you give it back to them, let's say you ask the students to write an essay, a short paper, 4 paragraphs about some topic. This is for more advanced students, okay? Let's say you have intermediate students or advanced students and you ask them to write a little paper, 4 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. And you take their paper and you go through and you look at it and you go, okay, well, this is a mistake, and you circle it. And you go, oh no, that's the wrong verb. Or you missed the past tense ending and you circle it. And you go, nope, that should be ED at the end. And you give that back to the student. And the student goes, oh, okay, yes, I understand that's wrong. I understand that's wrong. Then next week in class, without them having the chance to look at their grammar book or to look at a dictionary or anything, they just sit down at their desk and they write another essay and they hand it in to you, they give it to you, and you look at it and you look at the mistakes and you go, wait a minute, that's the same mistake you made last week. Oh, there's another mistake you made last week. Your students are going to make the same mistakes even after you correct them. Now, maybe they'll make a fewer mistakes in the first week than in the second week, or in the third week than in the second week. I'm sorry, in the second week than the first week, and so on. So maybe the number of mistakes will go down a little bit, but most of the mistakes that you correct will still be there. And that's true if you correct their speaking or if you correct their writing. Why? Why, if you tell them that what they did wrong, why doesn't it work? Well, the reason it doesn't work is something.
After correction, students make the same mistakes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Right. All right. And if we can't reconnect, I'll record the rest of it and send it to you so you'll have it. Okay. All right. So why doesn't it work? Why doesn't error correction work? Well, the reason is because when you correct somebody's mistake, you are correcting their conscious learning. You are addressing their conscious knowledge, not their unconscious knowledge. And remember, I said that when we communicate, including writing, 99% of the time, we're going to be using our acquisition, our acquired language. So correcting their learning, correcting their conscious knowledge, if you will, that doesn't help if you're using your acquisition. It only works if you use your learning. Here's something that you will also discover as a beginning teacher. If you correct a student's mistake and you ask them, do you know why this is wrong? Many times they will say, oh yes, I understand why that's wrong. That's the wrong past tense form. They'll know, in other words, they know the rule consciously, but when it comes time to actually using the rule, because it's so difficult to use our conscious learning because of time, because of knowledge, and because of focusing on the form, focusing on the correctness, focusing on whether this is written right. Our natural instinct is to focus on communication. It's to focus on meaning. So we talk about communication is about meaning. It's not about form. We, of course, want the correct form, but the first thing that we focus on is on meaning. And so because we're so focused on meaning, using our conscious learning in terms of focusing on it is very difficult to do. And as psychologists tell us, it's impossible to focus on two things at the same time. You can switch back and forth quickly, but you can only focus really on something one at a time. And we focus on meaning. So trying to correct mistakes is usually what we would call a sucker's bet in English. And a sucker's bet is a very bad wager, a very bad bet, taking a very bad risk. There's no sense doing it because it's not going to work 99% of the time, okay? So if I were to tell you, here's something you should do, but it will fail 99% of the time, you should say, Jeff, that's a pretty bad idea. I don't think I'm gonna do that. Error correction fails consistently because it's addressing the wrong system. It's addressing your learning and not your acquisition, okay? Now, I'm not the only one to say this. Steve Krashen says this. He's looked at the research. If you actually look at research on error correction, and I've done this, and John Truscott in Taiwan has done this. If you look at the scientific studies, you'll find that in almost every case, when you give lots of error correction to students, and then you go back, say a week later or a month later, and you ask them to write an essay or give a speech, they make pretty much the same mistakes. So the research says that error correction is not a very effective strategy. I'll go further and say that not only is it not effective, but it's actually harmful to a lot of students. It actually is bad for a lot of students, especially oral error correction. When a teacher corrects a student's mistakes, well, think about your own experience. When the teacher corrects your mistakes, do you go, oh, thanks for that correction, teacher. Oh, that was wonderful. I love that. Correct me some more. No, you probably didn't. You probably thought, oh, you were embarrassed, right? You made a mistake. It's like your mother or father correcting your mistakes. You go, oh no. It's psychologically difficult to have someone correct your mistakes. I don't care who it is, all right? And what happens in a classroom is that if you start correcting all of your students' mistakes, what's going to happen? They're not going to talk. They're going to be shy. They're not going to raise their hand because they don't want to be embarrassed. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. So oral error correction, I think, is a particularly bad idea. Some teachers, if they have really good relationships with their students, might make a small correction, perhaps by repeating the expression, but using the right verb or saying it in the correct way. That's a little better, but even that can sometimes be considered an error correction by the students and by all the other students who are in the classroom. So be very, very careful about correcting mistakes, especially oral mistakes. Writing mistakes, it's a little better because only the student sees the paper, but still, if you write an essay and the teacher has circled all of these 50 mistakes that you made, well, that's the word we would use is demoralizing. It's very depressing. You think, oh my goodness, I can't do anything right. So be very careful about the psychological effects, not just the linguistic effects of error correction. Okay, let's move on to a third topic, which I have on my list here, which is, what about your accent in English? How do I improve my accent? And this is related to error correction, because often teachers will try to fix the pronunciation of their students. And this is understandable. And I used to teach English for many years. I've taught Spanish for many years. I know that sometimes as a teacher, you just want your students to get it right, right? And so when a student mispronounces something, you want to fix their accent, okay? However, just like error correction in general, accent correction also is very, very difficult in terms of effective. In other words, it doesn't work very well. When you try to fix someone's accent, typically what happens is it has a psychological effect, but it doesn't have a linguistic effect. In other words, they'll feel perhaps a little bit more embarrassed, but you're not going to fix their pronunciation. Now, let's talk about pronunciation in a broader sense. Where do we get our accent? We get our accent, of course, from listening to other people, to listening to the people around you. And I don't know I know that there are different accents of Farsi. Some of you from Tehran probably have a different accent from those of you from the north of the country or the south of the country or the east of the country or the west. All languages have different accents. I have an accent. I'm from Minnesota, which is in the northern part of the United States. My accent is very different than someone from New York or Boston or someone from the South. Okay, those are all different English accents. I don't have those accents. Why? Well, two reasons really. First, I don't hear those accents every day. I didn't grow up with those accents. I live in California. I live in Los Angeles. I have a California accent. That's because I'm in California and that's what I hear. But there's a second really important reason why I don't speak with a New York accent or a British accent or an Australian accent, okay? I don't speak with any of those accents, and my accents are terrible, okay? I don't speak with those accents partly because I don't see myself as a New Yorker. My psychological identity is not as someone from the deep South in the United States. I don't speak like Donald Trump. I don't speak like the King of England. Why? Well, lots of good reasons, but the biggest reason is that's not my identity. That's not who I see myself as. I see myself as someone living in Los Angeles or someone from Minnesota. My identity, in other words, is very connected with my accent. Now, if I were to move to a different city, if I were to move to England, say, or if I were to move to Australia, slowly my accent would probably change, especially if I identified with or saw myself as somebody who was British. So identity, who you psychologically see yourself, is very important in terms of developing your accent. Now, can we do anything about that? And what about our students in our classroom? Is there a way of helping them see themselves as English speakers? It's a great question. I don't have a great answer, okay? Sometimes the teacher doesn't know the answer. That's a very important lesson that you should learn as a teacher if you're a beginning teacher. Sometimes you won't know the answer. Don't be afraid to tell your students, I don't know. Don't make something up, please. Just say, I don't know the answer, but I'll find out for you. Now, I don't know the answer about helping students with their accent, but I do know that trying to teach accent or accent reduction courses, according to the research we have, doesn't work very well. The research says that if you try to fix somebody's accent, it won't work very well. Why? Well, you know the answer why. Because if you're consciously trying to teach someone, you put your tongue here, or you put your tongue in the back of your mouth, what are you doing? What system of language are you addressing? Are you addressing their conscious knowledge or their unconscious knowledge? The conscious knowledge. If you tell someone something and you give them conscious instruction, you're affecting only their learning. Now, when you're talking, do you have time to stop and think, oh, I need to put my tongue in between my lips or in between my teeth? No, you don't have time to do that. So it's almost impossible to actually use conscious knowledge of pronunciation rules when you're speaking. You don't have the time. Plus, of course, you're not focused on the meaning. You're not focused on the form, rather, you're focused on what you're saying, not how you're saying it. So pronunciation is just a subset of the larger question of conscious instruction. Conscious instruction is limited because our monitor is limited. We don't have time, and if we do have time, we often don't know the rule. I mean, do you, veteran English teachers, do you know all the rules of pronunciation? I don't. 3, you're not focused on form, you're focused on meaning. And that is the most important thing and the most difficult thing to try to get away from, the focus on meaning. So I'll leave you with one more point about accents, because this is a one that all of us are interested in. I would love for my Spanish accent to be better, okay? There is one group of people for whom accent training seems to work. There's only one group of people I know. You know what that group is? Actors. Actors and actresses in the TV and the movie. Some of them are very, very good at imitating another accent. Isn't that interesting? If you ask a professional actor, and maybe some of you have acting experience, I don't know, but if you ask a professional actor to do a different accent, he or she will say, okay, let me study. And they'll go home and they'll listen to tapes of people with that accent. And sometimes they'll have a coach, a teacher that will teach them things like, you know, put your tongue here, or, do this, or the sound in the back of your mouth and all those things. And it seems to work for actors and actresses. Why? Here's my theory. The reason it works for actors is because what do actors do? What is the job of an actor? The job of an actor is to take on someone else's identity, to be someone else. So although it may look like the rules that they're being taught are working, I don't think it has anything to do with the conscious instruction. It can't. We know from the research it can't. Instead, what happens when an actor takes on a new accent is they listen and they acquire, and their identity shifts when they start acting. So good actors can take on new accents, not because they got accent training, but because they're able to shift their identities. They're able to see themselves as another person. And that's what a good actor does. That's why when you have a bad actor and you say, oh, that actor, he acts the same in every single movie. It's the same person. He just has different lines. That's a bad actor. Why? Because they can't put themselves into a different role. They can't put themselves into a different identity. So the real answer to the question is that we all have to become actors if you want to become a better, have a better accent. Okay. All right. My final word on accent is it's best probably not to worry about it too much. You don't have to have a perfect accent in English, okay? People will understand you even if you don't sound like a native speaker. And if you're an adult learning a language, you probably will never sound like a native speaker. It's possible, it happens with some people, but most of us will not have a completely 100% native accent in another language, and that's okay, all right? Don't worry about it. Don't worry about your accent, and don't worry too much about your accents of your students. As long as you can understand them, then it's okay, all right? Okay, let's move on to the next question, which is learning vocabulary. Now, I love talking about learning vocabulary. Amir knows this. The rest of other veteran teachers here, who, right, you know that I've talked about this a lot. So I'm going to try to limit myself because it's really hard because I want to spend the whole time talking about words. How do we learn new words? We learn new words the same way we learn all the rest of the systems of language. Comprehensible input. We learn words by understanding them in context. Remember before earlier I talked about how learning is all knowledge acquisition, let's call it, is taking what you know and applying it to what you don't know. So if there are 10 words in the sentence and there's one word you don't know, you can take the 9 words you do know and apply it to the one word you don't know to help figure it out. That's how we acquire vocabulary. Now notice I said 9 words that you know and 1 word that you don't know. I'm actually going to say it's probably more accurate to say that if you're reading a paragraph of 100 words, you know 95 or 98 of those words to figure out the 2 or 3 or maybe 5 that you don't know. In other words, you want to know a lot in order to acquire vocabulary efficiently. If I give you a paragraph and you only know 50% of the words, it's going to be really difficult for you to understand the other 50 words you don't know. Why? Because you don't have very much what we would call leverage, right? You don't have very much information to help you figure out the words you don't know. So the ratio, the percentage of words that you want to know it should be really high. If you want to improve your own vocabulary, don't pick a book that has 25% of the words you don't know. That's too hard. And when I say it's too hard, I mean you will have difficulty trying to figure out the 25% of the words because you only know 75. 75 isn't enough. We know this from a lot of research. We know from the research that the best case scenario, the best situation is to know at least 95% of the words to help you pick up most efficiently and effectively the 5 or 2 or even 1% of the words you don't know. The biggest mistake teachers make, especially when they're starting, is to give students language that is too difficult for them. You want to use simple words and simple structures when you're starting off with students. And as they get better, you want to keep the ratio, it should be relatively easy for them. Because if it's relatively easy for them, it will be easy for them to pick up new words faster. If you think, well, I'm going to give them something really hard, right? I'm going to give them something in which they only know 5% of the words. That's a waste of time. Because if you only know 5% of the words, there's no way you're going to figure out the other 95%. Not going to happen. So pick things, choose materials, use words that are easy for students that allow them to take their knowledge and pick up the few words that they don't know. All right. Let's move on to the next question. Well, it's kind of related. What about flashcards? Now, flashcards, as you probably know, are when you write the word on one side and then you write the definition on the other and you try to memorize it. This goes back, all of these questions really go back to the very first question about grammar instruction. What about memorizing words? Is it a good idea to try to memorize a list of words or to give your students a list of words and say, students, I want you to memorize these 10 words and I'm going to test them on you. I'm going to test them tomorrow and see if you've memorized these 10 words. What's going to happen? You know what's going to happen, right? They're going to come in and a couple of students are going to get 10 out of 10. Wow, fantastic. And then a few more students are going to get 8 or 9 out of 10. And then you're going to have a lot of students that get 5 out of 10, 4 out of 10, 3 out of 10. Okay. Why? Because memorization is really hard. Memorization is learning. It's your conscious system. And it's very difficult to try to memorize words because you keep forgetting them. Here's what we know from the research. And I recently looked at this research, and I've written a few papers on this. When you try to memorize words consciously, a couple of things happen. First, although you'll maybe be able to memorize the word and give a definition or give the translation, say English to Farsi, Farsi to English, if you try to actually see that, if you see that word in say a paragraph or in a book, it's not necessarily going to help you if you're able to give the translation. This seems paradoxical. This seems like a difficult concept. But we know from studies that when you try to teach people words and then you give them memorize words, and then you give them a reading passage in which they try to read the passage, the comprehension of the passage usually isn't any better. In other words, the kind of knowledge you get from memorization is what we call very shallow knowledge. It's shallow because it doesn't seem to affect the larger comprehension system. The only way to really affect the larger comprehension system, your acquisition, is to see that word many times over and over again in different contexts. In other words, you're acquiring it subconsciously. When you try to learn it consciously, not only is it very easy for you to forget it, but it doesn't seem to have the same effect in comprehension. The other thing I'll say about flashcards and trying to memorize vocabulary is that because we forget so quickly, you have to go back over and over again and keep reviewing the words. So let's say you try to memorize 100 words today. Well, tomorrow you're going to have to go back and look at 90 of those words again because you've forgotten them. And then the next day you're going to have to look at them again. And then the next day you're going to have to look at them again. And maybe in a week or 2 weeks, you can get 100% on your 100-word test. But the time you took to go back over and over again to review, you could have just been reading and acquiring words naturally. In fact, I've looked at the research, and what I've discovered is that it's more efficient, it's a better use of your time simply to read and listen to English you can understand. You will pick up, you will acquire more words more quickly through just getting good comprehensible input than if you were to try to memorize those words. So it's time, just looking at your time, it's actually faster just to listen and read comprehensible input. I can show you the math and how that works, but we don't have time. Maybe if I have a chance, I'll send one of my papers to Amir or one of your teachers, and they can share it with you. But at this point, just trust me that efficiency-wise, it's faster just to get good comprehensible input than to try to memorize words. Also, memorizing words is really boring. I mean, it's really boring, right? I don't know anyone who says, oh, I love memorizing. Give me more flashcards, teacher. No, it's boring. Also, when you memorize words, even if you succeed in memorizing words, the only benefit is the word. But if you listen to comprehensible input, if you read and listen to good comprehensible input, not only do you get vocabulary, you get syntax, you get phonology, you get usage, you get knowledge of the world, and it's much more interesting, okay? So there really isn't a good argument, I don't think, for using flashcards. The only example I can think of would be if you're going to another country and you want to memorize the word for thank you or please. Yeah, I went to Greece, lucky enough to go to Greece a couple of years ago. And so I memorized parakalo, which I think means please. Amir, you probably know a little Greek. Or efcharisto, that means thank you. Aren't you impressed? My Greek's pretty good, huh? Right? 2 words. All right, that's about the only thing reason I think you would want to memorize words is if you have a very limited number of things that you are trying to say. All right, let's move on to the next question. Extensive reading, what is it and is it a good idea? Extensive reading just means reading a lot of things in a language you don't understand. Ideally, reading things that you mostly understand already. Remember, I talked about that 95% rule. If you're going to acquire new vocabulary or understand something, you really want to know about 95% of the words already. And that gives you a great chance of picking up the 5% that you don't know. So extensive reading, the concept of extensive reading is doing a lot of reading in another language, but reading that is appropriate to your level. What do I mean by appropriate to your level? Well, if you're listening to me, you're an advanced listener and speaker of English, or at least a high intermediate. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to understand what I'm saying, okay? That means that you probably don't want to read a book for a very beginner. It's too easy for you. There's nothing new for you to acquire, right? You know all the words, so there's no sense reading that. But you need to read something a little harder, but not too hard. You don't want to read Shakespeare. You don't want to read Chaucer in Old English. You don't want to read the most difficult writers in modern English. Those are probably going to be too difficult. That's not what extensive reading is. Extensive reading is taking something that you like reading, that you want to read, and that is easy enough for you to read by yourself. What do I mean by yourself? I mean, if you have to stop every sentence and look up a word in the dictionary, or if you have an electronic reader, press and get the definition, that's probably too difficult for you. If you're stopping every minute or every 2 minutes even and have to stop and go, wait a minute, what is that word again? If you're doing that, you're probably looking at or reading something that's too hard for you. Now, I'm not saying that you can't use the dictionary, okay? I use the dictionary all the time when I'm reading something in French or in Spanish or in Italian and I don't understand it. I look it up, okay? That's okay. But it's better to get into the habit of trying to guess the word from context, figure it out from context. And if you can't figure it out, usually it's best just to keep reading, because often it'll make sense after you read it. You'll go to the next paragraph and go, oh, that's what that word was. However, if you're doing that all the time, every sentence has a word you don't know, that's probably too difficult for you. So you want to give your students lots of things to read. Even beginning students can read, once they're able to read, say, 500 words, say, you can find them things or create things for them to read that they understand almost everything. Almost everything is the key. If they can understand almost everything, but not everything, that's a good source of reading material for you. So extensive reading is a wonderful idea for you as a teacher to continue to improve your English. You should always be reading or listening to English every day if you can. Doesn't have to be for 3 hours, doesn't have to be Shakespeare. In fact, it probably shouldn't be Shakespeare. It should be something that you enjoy and something that you can mostly understand. If you're doing those two things, your English will get better and your students' English will get better. Now, we don't have time to go into all the different questions about extensive reading, like, how long should you do it? Should you do it in class? Should you have students do it as homework? I actually think, I'll just answer that question. I think a little bit in class is okay. I know that sometimes you won't have a lot of time and maybe students don't want to read in class, but even 5 or 10 minutes of giving students a chance to just sit there and read something that they like in English, that can be very powerful. Not because of the 5 minutes. 5 minutes isn't enough, right? What you want to do is you want to get them hooked on books. And hooked on means you want to get them interested enough to take that home and continue reading it. So one of your jobs as a teacher is not just to try to teach English in class, It's to try to motivate your students, to excite your students so much that they want to go home and continue acquiring English outside of the class. The world's best teachers are not the ones that teach in the classroom. They're the ones that inspire, excite, motivate their students to continue learning and acquiring outside of the classroom. And that's why your teachers, I know, are so good, because they do that not just for you, they do that for me. I've picked up a lot of things just by giving these talks. So that sort of inspiration is important as a teacher. All right, a couple more questions here. How are we doing on time? Got a couple more minutes. How do you find good comprehensible input? There are things called graded readers. We were talking about extensive reading. Graded readers are readers that are written for people who are learning English. And if you are teaching students or perhaps want to improve your own English, that's an excellent source. There are so many places now that have lots of English that I don't know if I need to spend a lot of time on this question. I will say that there is a new source of English that some people are perhaps a little afraid of, especially teachers are a little afraid of, but I don't think they should be. And that is artificial intelligence. So-called, here we have something called Chat GPT. I don't know if that's accessible, but any form of artificial intelligence that can produce English that's comprehensible, that's great. As a teacher, if you have access to these AI or artificial intelligence tools, what you want to do is say, write me a story that a very beginning English student can understand. It will write you a story. And if it's too difficult, say, it's too difficult. Write me an even easier story. Or write me a story that only uses the first 500 words of English. And it will do that for you. And then you can take that to your students. And now you have something for your students to read on any topic you want. Write me a story about the geography of northern Iran that is written in very easy English. Boom. AI can do that for you. So don't be afraid, teachers, of AI. It's not going to replace you, unless you're a very bad teacher, of course, then maybe you should be replaced. It's not going to replace you. You can use it as a resource. And 99% of the people right now who are trying to take AI and create language courses are going to do it wrong. Why? Because they don't understand the language acquisition theory that I've been giving you. But you do understand it, and you can use it to your advantage. Create lots of good comprehensible input with artificial intelligence, with what are called large language models, these AI things that you can get on the web. Use those to create good comprehensible input, and you will become a better teacher. And your students will learn English faster. Nothing wrong with it if you use it correctly. Okay. Is there any way, next question, is there any way to speed up the language acquisition process? Yes. Give students even more comprehensible input. The only way to speed up language acquisition is to get more of the good stuff. It's like if you were skinny, most of us don't have this problem, but if you were really skinny and you wanted to gain weight, you know, you were 18 years old and you're trying to put on muscle, and you what's the best way to gain weight? Eat more food, okay? What's the best way to improve your English? Eat more English, good English, comprehensible English, comprehensible input. That's the way, and that's the only way to improve it. Know also that it takes a long time to become really good at English. If you were a student, a 10-year-old student, and you came to the United States and you went to schools here in the United States, on average, it would take you about 5 years to be at what we call the 50th percentile, to be at the average reading and writing level of a student in the United States. It takes immigrants to the United States, child immigrants, about 5 years. And that's when they live in the United States. So you living in Iran, not being surrounded by English, it's going to take a long time. Don't worry about it. I think people get too worried about how quickly they're doing something. No, remember, it takes a long time to acquire any language. So don't be impatient with yourself and don't be impatient with your students. It will take time. It will happen if you give them the right food, if you give them comprehensible input, but it's not going to happen in a week or a month or even a year. Okay. I'm almost out of time. One of the questions I had was how we deal with students who are different in the classroom. I think the question here is what should we do with students? One student is way up here and one student is way down here. This is a classic problem for teachers. I don't have an easy solution. One thing that I try to do as a teacher, if I have students at different levels in my classroom, is I try to make sure that I'm doing some things that this person will benefit from, comprehensible input up here, but also comprehensible input down here. However, if you have to choose between going high and going low, go low. Because if you go low, the person up here will still get some benefit. But if you only go high, if you only talk to the 5 students who are way up here, well, then the rest of your students are going to be lost. So remember, when you have different levels of English in your classroom, you may need to do some smart things in terms of what they do outside of the classroom. But when you're in the classroom, you need to understand maybe doing group work. Maybe you work with one group here, one group over there, one group over there. You have to be creative as a teacher. It's not an easy thing to do, but every teacher has this problem. So you're not alone in that issue. Okay. I think I've covered most of my questions. We have a few minutes, I guess, for questions or comments. I'll pass it back to you, Amir.
So on behalf of everyone, Jeff, it was a great session. So every time I decide this is going to be the last time I'm attending Jeff's session, next time I'm not going to be there, then I realize that there's a lot to catch up on. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. It was great. You're contributing a lot to shaping teachers' minds, at least in our area, in Zanjan, which is a small town. But great things are happening, and you are a big part of it, Jeff. Thank you so much. So let's open the floor to people, and I'd be happier if younger teachers, like newcomers, wanted to ask questions. So does anyone have a question? Who's talking?
It's me, Sina.
Sina, go ahead.
Yeah. Professor, you said that acquiring a knowledge in each person is different. And it's not like sitting in our bedroom and study. It takes some time to acquire the knowledge. So my question is, why we reject students, or better to say, why do students fail when they don't get proper scores during the term? Isn't failing equals to ruining their motivation, especially in younger ages? Or shouldn't we let them pass and see if they can acquire that knowledge in next terms?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It's hard one for me to answer because it depends on the different schools have different policies, and I don't know how that may work in the schools where you're teaching. In general, however, it is true that language acquisition doesn't follow the school schedule. It's not as though just because you're in first grade, you're going to speak language like a first grader, and second grade language like a second grader. Because our own language acquisition device, our brains are different, people learn at different rates. So I agree with you that we shouldn't be failing students in the sense that they will never be able to get more exposure. What you want to do with a student who is failing is you want to give them even more English. You want to give them even more help. Now, how that actually looks in a particular school, I can't comment on because it just depends on the university, or it depends on the school. When I was a language teacher, I tried not to fail any students. I used criteria that had more to do with their effort than that did with their performance. But you know, again, that's going to depend on the school. But it's a great point to remember that, you know, we don't necessarily follow the same steps as a school might follow. Our language, our brains are different, and they will move at different paces. Yeah, good question.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Professor.
Any other questions?
Sorry, may I ask a question?
Ali Targhi, go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, can I open my?
Yeah.
So my question is about kind of acquisition and acquiring English knowledge. And you know that we live in a non-English speaking country, and people can't really talk English to other one in the society. So that's a problem. And as a teacher or a learner, what do you suggest as tasks or things to do to make up for that, or kind of help them get better? And
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, good question, Ali. Very good question. Well, there are a couple of things to keep in mind here. Number one, you can always talk to each other. And of course, it's a great thing for a teacher to be able to do what we would call structured activities. So you don't want to just say to two students, okay, now you guys talk about the weather. Okay, that's probably not the best activity, because they're going to probably switch into Farsi and start talking about the football game yesterday, or, you know, whatever. You as a teacher, you need to have an activity that's very focused for them, to help them. So you may give them a series of phrases to use, for example, and say, or you may have what's called an information gap activity, where one person has one set of information and one person has another set of information, and they have to exchange that information, not looking at each other's paper. You want to give them those kinds of opportunities to speak that are controlled enough so that they can be successful, so they can feel like they're actually saying something. Okay, I think that's very important, especially for beginning students. Okay, the other thing to remember, however, Ali, and this is very important to you, and your English is great, by the way. The other thing to remember is that we can get better at English without speaking. Language acquisition comes from comprehensible input. That's the language that goes into your brain. Speaking and writing is language that comes out of your brain. You don't need to speak and write to become a better at English. You will get better at English even if you're not able to speak and write. I know people who have never left their home country, but their English is very good, even though they haven't spoken to very many people, and they go to another country and they're able to speak. Why? Because they got lots of comprehensible input. So output is helpful, it's useful for confidence, but it's not actually necessary. You could become a perfectly fluent English speaker by never speaking English. Why? Because it's all about comprehensible input. Now, I'm not suggesting that. Okay, I'm not saying you should never talk. No, I'm saying that technically, theoretically, if you will, it's not necessary, which means, and that's great news for all of us. I don't have to go to Italy to become a better Italian speaker. I just have to listen and read a lot of Italian. And if I do, my Italian will get better. All right. I think I may have to run at this point, Amir.
Okay.
I'm hoping that you're able to kind of put the videos together and get everything to work.
Will. And apologies for that again, Jeff. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so very much, Professor.
And once again, acknowledging that Jeff is doing all this for free. The information he's sharing is so valuable, but he's not charging anyone. He's sharing his knowledge with us for free. Thank you so much, Jeff. And all the best. And enjoy the rest of the day. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, see you later. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention.
Bye.
Thank you. Everyone, before you leave the session, please write your names in the chat.